Ancestry.com, Charlie Brown, and a prophetess today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through the book of Matthew chapter 1 and also Luke chapter 2 verses 1 through 38. Now for tomorrow's reading we're going to do Matthew chapter 2 and Luke chapter 2 verse 39 through 52. So what does the Bible have in store for us today? So as I introduce the book of Matthew here to you, the Old Testament prophets predicted and longed for the coming of the Messiah who would enter history and bring redemption and deliverance. Through a carefully selected series of Old Testament quotations, Matthew documents Jesus Christ's claim to be the King of the Jews. Matthew also outlines the characteristics of the kingdom of God, both for Israel and the church. Now, Jesus' lineage, his genealogy, his baptism, his messages, and miracles all point to the same inescapable conclusion here in this book, that Jesus is King, the long-awaited Messiah. So, Matthew, Christian tradition has basically given the authorship of Matthew to Matthew, but technically it was written anonymously. It doesn't really say that I, Matthew, have written this book. It's not signed anywhere, so you don't get that. But this is the book of Matthew by Christian tradition. It was written around AD 50 to AD 65-ish, so clearly after Jesus has gone. Let's get into what Matthew has to say. So chapter 1 starts off with verse 1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he's basically doing this genealogy in 3 sections. So there are several important themes that happen throughout this genealogy, though. And this is probably one of the most debated sections of Matthew, or even in the 4 Gospels that there are, is this genealogy here. Now, Jesus is identified as the Christ, the Messiah, the King anointed by God to rule over his people. This is reiterated by identifying Jesus as a son of David, because we know that Old Testament prophecies such as 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 16 and also Isaiah chapter 9 verses 2 through 7 foretold that the Messiah would be a descendant of King David. So that is important. This lineage here shows that he meets this qualification essentially. So just as Abraham was the father of the nation of Israel, at the beginning of this genealogy, Jesus is going to be the father of, or the founder of, a new spiritual Israel, so to speak, as we get to it. Now, there are actually mentions of women in this genealogy, which is a rarity in the Bible. But the mention of these women signals God's intention to include both Gentiles and women in his redemptive plan. You get Tamar and Rahab and Ruth, and also Uriah's wife in the first 2 sections. But you also get a 5th woman, which is Mary, listed here because, of course, this miraculous birth was important. Matthew's also written here that David is the king. This is the only one in this lineage that is specified as being a king, King David. The rest of them, there are kings that are mentioned in here, but none of them are mentioned as king. Just throwing that out there. Now, this genealogy here agrees with the genealogies of 1 Chronicles 1 through 3 and Luke chapter 3, verse 23 through 38, from the generation of Abraham down to David. But after David, Matthew's genealogy agrees with that of 1 Chronicles, all except for a few intentional gaps, but it departs significantly from Luke's. Now, some interpreters argue that from this, that one or both of the New Testament genealogies is inaccurate. However, that's really not the case. Jews in David's line carefully preserved their genealogies because they knew from the Old Testament prophecies that one of their descendants would be the Messiah. And also David's descendants had this privilege of providing firewood for the altar in Jerusalem. So naturally, they're going to keep careful records to demonstrate their Davidic descent to preserve their privileges and their positions and jobs. And this is evidenced in other writings such as Josephus or Life 1 and other rabbinic texts that suggest that genealogical archives were kept in public records. You also got to keep in mind Luke's genealogy was written in a different style, a different manner, and a different format. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Matthew's format versus Luke's format as we go on. Luke's format actually goes backwards and starts with Jesus and Joseph, and it goes backwards all the way to Adam and even God himself. So basically showing that Jesus was not just a descendant of David, but also a descendant of God's created Adam. So he goes all the way back. So they were kind of done for two different purposes. Now, Matthew's arrangement of this genealogy into three sets, and each of these three sets were 14 generations long. It's probably an example of what's called Gematria, however you want to say it, which is a system of assigned numerical values to letters of the alphabet. In other words, A equals 1, B equals 2, etc., in order to communicate a subtle message. Now, in Hebrew, the numerical value of the letters composing the name David is 14. Thus, Matthew's artistic arrangement here probably highlights Jesus' Davidic lineage. If Matthew did intentionally use this numerology or gematria, this supports the view that he originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew from the gematria functions in the Hebrew versions of the genealogy and not in the Greek. So this book was probably originally written in Hebrew because of this point. Jesus's birth here differed from those of everyone else in the genealogy. You have to keep that in mind. Although several of the people that were conceived in this genealogy were conceived by miracles, they all had a human father. So the difference here is only Jesus was born of a virgin. And Mary had been engaged to Joseph. Now that throws people off there. Well, if he's engaged, he probably had sex with her. All right, well, no, that's not the case, because an ancient Jewish engagement was actually as legally binding as a marriage was. It was an official state. It was just like marriage between someone is a legal binding. An engagement in old Jewish tradition was a legally binding thing. And the only way to get out of this legally binding engagement is to file for a divorce and be legally divorced from this person. Thus, you see Joseph's decision in chapter 1, verse 19 here, that he's decided he may want to divorce her. But before they came together means that Joseph and Mary had not yet had intercourse. So Joseph thus assumed that Mary had been unfaithful. So God ends up speaking to Joseph through a dream, just like he did to his Old Testament namesake in Genesis chapter 37, verses 1 through 11. That was an interesting connection. The title Son of David reminded Joseph of his royal lineage and prepared him for the announcement of the Messiah's birth as we move on. And Jesus, of course, is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua, which means Yahweh saves. And of course, it says you will give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. I found that interesting. Of course, verse 23, it calls him Emmanuel, which means God with us. That implies is Jesus' divinity. And Mary's virgin-born son would be God himself living among his people. I found that to be just absolutely amazing. So from there, we're going to move on to Luke. So Luke chapter 2. We start out here with the birth of Jesus. Now on your screen you see here one of the most famous scenes from A Charlie Brown Christmas, as he basically tells the Christmas story. We start out in chapter 2 with Caesar Augustus, who was actually Caesar, the Roman Caesar from 31 BC to AD 14. And he has his decree that the whole empire must be registered. Now, this was specifically for the purposes of taxation and military service in this instance here. We're not talking about King Herod's decree. We're talking about the Roman Caesar's decree. So everybody had to go to their town and register. And when it says his own town, it doesn't mean the town that they're currently living in or the town they were born, but the town that their ancestors were from. So thus, Joseph and Mary had to uproot, head out, and go all the way to Bethlehem in Judea, which was also known as the city of David, which is where his people were from. And of course, when they get there, Jesus is born. And he is born in a manger. Why was he born in a manger? Because there was no room in the inn available for them. Now, we get into this next interesting thing. Jesus was born, and we know the Christmas story, but one thing popped up in verse 19 for me of chapter 2 is, but Mary was treasuring up all these things in her heart and meditating on them. And I got to thinking, how in the world would Luke know what's in Mary's heart? Well, it's actually possible, after reading into some of this stuff, that Luke gained much of his knowledge about what happened here in chapter 1 and 2 from actually talking to Mary herself, who recalled the things that she had treasured in her heart to him. So he was alive at the time, he was involved at the time, and this would have been a report from a primary source for all you historians out there. This is a primary source observation from the Bible. And of course, we go through Jesus' circumcision in his presentation, and he is presented they go to the temple basically to present him, and there's this prophet Simeon here, and it says here in verse 26, it has been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he saw the Lord's Messiah. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to perform for him what was customary under the law, and it was the circumcision and the presentation, Simeon took him up in his arms and praised God and said, now, Master, you can dismiss your servant in peace as you promised. I can die now because I have seen the Messiah. Now, this probably would have been an interesting thing for Joseph and Mary to see. He says, for my eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the presence of all peoples, the light for revelation to the Gentiles and glory to your people Israel. That must have been an amazing experience for them. Now, there's also this section that is called Anna's testimony. If you see the picture on the left, the really old lady, this lady Anna was a prophetess, and it said here that she had been married for 7 years and that she'd been a widow for 84 years. You add that up, that's like 90 something years already. So 91 years. And then how old would she have been when she got married? She would have been well over 100 years old. That's the depiction of the old lady Anna here. And it was at that very moment that she came up and began to thank God and to speak about him to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Now, this is interesting because Luke, through his book, he emphasizes women in many occasions, and the other prophetess that's mentioned in the New Testament are Philip's daughters, who are mentioned in Acts chapter 21, verses 8 through 9. So, there we have that, because, of course, Luke would have been given authorship of Acts as well. So that continues his emphasis on women in both ministry roles and their inclusion in leadership roles. I hope this has helped you with your studies today. If it has, click that like button, subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow, for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.